The Dark Age of Gucci, and how it became an empire. There's a comfortable and completely false idea that great empires are born, organized, elegant, and under control. The truth is far less glamorous. Many of the world's most powerful brands have gone through chaos, serious mistakes, and near-suicidal decisions. Gucci is no exception. In fact, it's perhaps the best example of how rock bottom, when properly interpreted, can become a foundation. And that's unsettling because it contradicts everything that's sold out there about quick and linear success. The curious thing is that, while many people associate failure with inability, Gucci's story shows the opposite. The problem was almost never a lack of talent, but an excess of ego, pride, and attachment to the past. How many people today are trapped in exactly that? They hold on to projects that have already failed, insist on identities that no longer work, and call it persistence, when in reality it's fear of starting over. The vague discomfort of this realization is the first step towards change. Throughout this story, it becomes clear that prosperity doesn't stem from perfection, but from the courage to face harsh truths and act even without guarantees. It's not just about fashion, luxury, or money. It's about vision, timing, and decision-making. And if you look closely, you'll realize that this narrative speaks less about an Italian brand, and much more about the choices we all make when life is in crisis and demands reinvention. The birth of Gucci and the promise of elegance that no one imagined where it would end up. The story begins in a way that's almost too simple for those who associate it with modern society. Gucci power, status, and global desire. Gucci wasn't born surrounded by luxury. On the contrary, he observed it. He observed suitcases, fabrics, behaviors. Working in luxury hotels, he noticed something curious. It wasn't just about money. It was about as people wanted to be seen. There, a silent promise of elegance was born, made more of perception than ostentation, something that few understood at the beginning. The first step was artisanal, almost timid, but full of intention. Finely crafted leather, functional design, and an obsessive attention to detail. Gucci understood that luxury doesn't shout, it whispers, and that whisper creates curiosity, desire, and authority. It's like life. Those who try to appear too big too soon tend to stumble. Those who build with patience create deep roots. It's no coincidence that the brand began by winning over those who knew how to recognize quality before fashion became a spectacle. This brings us to a practical lesson that few people apply. Observe before acting. Whether in business, a career, or a personal project, understanding the environment is worth more than copying trends. Gucci didn't invent luxury, he interpreted what people wanted to feel when touching a product. But, like any good story, when something starts to go right too quickly, greater ambitions, inflated egos, and hasty decisions emerge. And it is precisely there that elegance begins to share space with shadow. Rapid rise and the first sign of trouble, when luxury becomes a battleground within the family itself. With the name gaining traction and money starting to circulate, something shifted in the air, and it wasn't just the revenue. The accelerated success brought prestige, but also triggered a classic side effect, the feeling that everything needed to grow more, faster, and under absolute control. When a family business thrives, it carries two opposing forces in the same package: unity and competition. And at this point in the story, the balance began to tip dangerously towards the latter. Luxury, once a silent construction, has become territory. Decisions that were once strategic have become emotional. Each heir wanted to leave their mark, prove their worth, demonstrate their power. It's like a company that grows without internal alignment. On the outside, everything seems impeccable. On the inside, things are boiling behind the scenes. In real life, this happens all the time. Families, partnerships, even friendships crumble not for lack of money, but for an excess of poorly managed ego. Here's a practical application that few people like to hear. Growth requires emotional governance. Leaders need to separate personal identity from strategic decisions. In business, this means clear contracts. In life, difficult conversations had early on. Ignoring small conflicts for fear of confrontation is like sweeping dust under an elegant rug. Eventually, the rug will lift. And it was precisely this silent accumulation that began to transform success into constant tension, preparing the ground for something much bigger and much more destructive. The Gucci War. Betrayals, legal battles, sabotage, and the beginning of ruin. What were once disagreements turned into open warfare, the kind that doesn't stay confined to the meeting table. Lawsuits, public accusations, broken alliances, and decisions made more out of revenge than strategy began to erode the foundation of the empire. When a brand reaches this stage, it stops competing with the market and starts fighting against itself. And, let's face it, that's the hardest fight to win, because nobody wants to give in. Each internal movement seemed to pull the rug out from under the others. One would throw something out just to contradict. Another would block decisions out of spite, and so the focus completely shifted away from the client. It's like a football team where the players fight amongst themselves. The uniform is beautiful, the stadium is full, but the game simply doesn't happen. In the real world, this repeats itself in companies, families, and even personal projects that stall because pride speaks louder than purpose. Here's a practical and uncomfortable lesson. Unresolved conflicts exact a high interest rate. When you postpone difficult decisions, the price doesn't stay the same. It increases. In any serious project, a tough conversation today is better than a silent collapse tomorrow. But at that moment, nobody wanted to be the adult in the room. And while the internal battles continued, something much more serious was approaching. Silent, inevitable. An event that would change everything at once. The murder of Maurizio Gucci, the darkest point in the brand's history. Just when the story seemed to have gone too far, came the shock that no one had imagined. Or perhaps they had imagined it, but chose to ignore it. Maurizio Gucci, he was murdered in broad daylight, and the world of luxury, always so controlled and silent, was thrown into the center of a public tragedy. Suddenly, the brand ceased to be merely synonymous with elegance and began to carry an emotional weight that was difficult to bear. Glamour gave way to bewilderment. The most disturbing aspect wasn't just the crime itself, but what it revealed about what went on behind the scenes. Relationships tainted by resentment, decisions driven by pain, and an environment where no one trusted anyone anymore. It's like when a personal or professional project reaches such a toxic point that there's no turning back without a rupture. The murder acted as a brutal mirror. Everything that had been poorly resolved came to the surface at once. Here lies a harsh, yet valuable lesson. When internal conflicts are left unaddressed, they don't disappear. They escalate. On a smaller scale, this happens when someone lives for years trapped by resentment, disputes, or desires for control, until something breaks. The tragedy marked rock bottom, but also created a void. And, curiously, it is in this void that the greatest possibilities for change arise. Because after absolute chaos, only two options remain: disappear or reinvent oneself completely. The brand collapses, sales plummet, creative disorganization, and a complete loss of relevance. After the shock came the silence, and it was deafening. Without clear direction, the brand began to lose its way in disconnected decisions, collections lacking identity, and communication that no longer resonated with anyone. The market changed, consumers changed, but the internal structure remained stuck in the past, trying to survive with what had once worked. And when that happens, the fall isn't dramatic. It's slow, continuous, and cruel. Creativity, once a distinguishing factor, has become a source of confusion. Designers came and went, strategies were changed midway, and the public simply stopped paying attention. It's like a talented professional who doesn't keep up to date. It's not a lack of ability, it's a lack of contextual understanding. In the real world, how many people continue to insist on old methods expecting new results? That's right. The market doesn't have nostalgia. It rewards relevance. Here's a practical point that separates those who survive from those who disappear. Knowing when something no longer works. In projects, careers, or personal life, persisting out of pride is often more dangerous than starting over with humility. The brand was rich in history, but poor in current vision. And it was precisely this near end that created space for unpopular, risky, and bold decisions. The kind that only appear when there's nothing left to lose. The unexpected turn of events, the arrival of new leaders and the decision to risk everything. When all seemed lost, a choice arose that few would dare to make: radical change or disappear in silence. It was in this context that they entered. Tom Ford and Domenico De Sole. These two names understood something essential. Brands don't die for lack of a past. They die for lack of vision. They didn't try to fix the old. They decided to redesign the future, even under criticism and general distrust. The strategy was almost counterintuitive. Instead of trying to please everyone, they chose a clear, strong, and even provocative identity. They cut out excesses, aligned their message, and refocused on what really mattered: desire. It's like in life when someone decides to stop being everything to everyone and starts being exactly who they need to be. This type of decision is frightening because it involves losing people along the way, but it also creates space to attract the right ones. Here's an applicable lesson. Starting over requires strategic courage. In business, this might mean changing niches, repositioning a brand, or changing partners. In personal life, it could mean changing habits, social circles, or even old plans. The common mistake is waiting for the ideal moment, which almost never comes. They acted when the risk was highest, and interestingly, it's at this point that clarity usually appears. From then on, something began to change in the air, and the attentive market realized that Gucci was about to be reborn in a way no one expected. The rebirth of Gucci, the creative shock that changed fashion forever. The turnaround wasn't subtle, nor should it have been. The new Gucci emerged with personality, boldness, and an aesthetic that divided opinions, which is always a good sign when you want to get back into the big game. Instead of seeking immediate approval, the brand chose to provoke conversation. Stronger colors, assertive sensuality, campaigns with attitude. It was like saying to the market, either you feel something or you feel nothing. And feeling, let's face it, is what creates desire. This creative clash did something rare. It reconnected the brand with the culture of its time. Celebrities started wearing it again, editorials began commenting on it, and the younger audience, who had previously ignored it, began paying attention. It's the same logic as a professional who decides to truly update themselves. They study, observe, test, and accept making mistakes quickly. Those who reinvent themselves don't ask for permission. They deliver results. Gucci stopped trying to please the past and started leading the present. Here's a direct application. Reinvention isn't makeup, it's essence. Simply changing your appearance without altering your inner message doesn't sustain growth. Whether in business, a career, or even personal life, the leap happens when you embrace who you are, even if that alienates some. Interestingly, it's at this moment that the right allies emerge. And while aesthetics gained momentum, something even greater began to take shape behind the scenes. Transformation that went beyond fashion and touched the collective imagination. How Gucci became a global empire of desire, status, and storytelling. The next step was to transform creativity into a system. It wasn't enough to launch iconic pieces. It was necessary to tell coherent stories at every touchpoint. Window displays, campaigns, fashion shows, pop culture. The brand began to sell a universe. It's not just about products. When someone bought something, they were also buying a stance, an attitude, a clear social symbol. It's like when a person aligns their speech, behavior, and routine. Everything starts to communicate the same message. The expansion was strategic and calculated. Accessories became the gateway, collaborations broadened reach, and celebrities helped translate the aesthetic to the mainstream. None of this happened by chance. There was data analysis, understanding of behavior, and the courage to occupy cultural spaces. In practice, this teaches that sustainable growth comes from intelligent repetition, doing the essentials well repeatedly, without losing identity. Here's an applicable lesson. Empires are built when value is clear and replicable. In business, this means processes. In life, habits. Those who rely solely on bursts of inspiration don't scale. The brand understood this and consolidated its global presence without diluting its essence. And when everything finally seems stable, the most uncomfortable question arises: how to maintain relevance without betraying its own DNA? That's where the deepest lessons of this journey come in. What Gucci's success reveals about reinvention, branding, and longevity in luxury. The greatest lesson from this journey lies not in the numbers, but in the ability to change without losing its soul. The brand has learned that tradition is not a prison. It's a starting point. Reinventing itself didn't mean denying the past, but rather reinterpreting it for a new era. In practice, it's like someone maturing, carrying their stories with them, but not living as a prisoner of them. This keen understanding of time is what separates fleeting brands from lasting legacies. Another less obvious point is the power of branding as a living narrative. It's not about logos, color palettes, or slogans, but about consistency over time. When discourse, product, and attitude align, the audience feels it, even without being able to explain it. In everyday life, this also applies to people. Reputation is what remains when you're not in the room. Building it requires consistency, not shortcuts. Ultimately, longevity stems from the courage to ask uncomfortable questions before the market asks them for you. What needs to change now? What has already been achieved? Where are we repeating formulas for comfort? Companies, careers, and lives fall into crisis when they avoid these questions. And while many become complacent after winning, those who remain relevant keep the creative restlessness alive, because the next cycle always begins before the current one ends. The empire only lasts when you decide to truly change. The Gucci story poses a thought-provoking question that can't be ignored. How many times have you realized something needed to change, but preferred to put it off? Because change hurts. It affects your ego. It breaks comfortable routines. But continuing as before also comes at a price, and almost always a higher one. The knowledge you've just absorbed only becomes power when it's put into practice, even if it's just in small daily adjustments. Now comes the uncomfortable question. What in your life is urgently demanding reinvention? A project you're clinging to out of pride? A career that no longer represents who you've become? Or even habits that are sabotaging your results? Choose just one thing and do something concrete today. Read more. Start by Think and Grow Rich. Organize your ideas, as Napoleon Hill said. Write everything down on paper now. Clarity comes from action, not from endless reflection. And here's the final push. Stories like this aren't entertainment. They're maps. Maps for those willing to take a step forward. If this content made you think differently, question certainties, or see possibilities, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep walking with us. Because learning is good, but transforming your own life is infinitely better.